everyone, it's Fox. A couple different people asked me to make this video, just a video sort of talking about different Holmes adaptations. Now, I have to say, I haven't watched every single Holmes adaptation, and even if I had, I couldn't possibly fit reviews of all of them into one single video. So instead what I've decided to do today is talk about different adaptations via talking about trends in adaptations. Since a lot of adaptations build on each other and not just on the canon, there are different things that have been carried throughout adaptations, and in fact have become sort of cultural misconceptions about the canon through being in so many adaptations, which is kind of a problem, but we'll get to that later, more in-depth conversation on how that happens and why it's sort of troubling. But anyway, before I do that, I do want to put a disclaimer at the beginning of this video. I have my own biases about adaptations. I have adaptations I prefer, adaptations I don't like. I like a lot more adaptations than almost anybody I've ever met. I like everything from Asylum Holmes, which is the one with the tentacle monsters and the dinosaurs, and I love Granada. Granada's like my favorite. So I like the really accurate, I like the really fun ones, but there are just things that, I mean, I have opinions, and those opinions are probably going to be demonstrated. If you disagree with me, that's fine, that's what YouTube comments are for, but I just wanted to say that at the beginning of the video. Also, I want to say, I'm going to be criticizing even adaptations that I like in this video, because I feel like they've participated in this sort of trend making of some things that I don't like that are trends in adaptations. So that's going to happen too, and know that I do still like those adaptations, and I think they're very valuable in a lot of different ways, but I still think that they're worth criticizing. In fact, I almost think they're more worth criticizing because I like them so much. So, now that all that's out of the way, we can start talking about adaptations. So, I want to start by talking about one of the earliest adaptations, which is William Gillette's Sherlock Holmes. It was a stage play. It was originally written and staged in 1899. Which means that it was written while Arthur Conan Doyle was still alive. So, one of the reasons that you may have heard of this adaptation is because it's the source of the story in which Conan Doyle sent a telegram to someone which said, "You may marry or murder or do what you like with him." So, if you've heard that story, that was a telegram that Arthur Conan Doyle sent to William Gillette when William Gillette was writing, actually, Sherlock Holmes, the play. And it was because William Gillette asked him if he could marry off Holmes. Holmes did have a love interest in the play, but we'll get to that later. Anyway, the other reason that you may, well, at least you maybe should be aware of this play, is because it's the source, well, one of the sources, I guess, but one of the original sources for a lot of very, very popular cultural misconceptions about Holmes as a character, Holmes as a narrative, and some of the little piddly things that are just kind of annoying to people like me who like to be grumpy old people. I may not be old on the outside, but I am a grumpy old woman on the inside. So, this adaptation, it was actually based on 3 different stories. It was based on A Study in Scarlet, on Scandal in Bohemia, and on The Final Problem. Which means, obviously, that it didn't do a great job of adapting any of those, because it kind of jumbled them all together. But, again, that's my own feelings about canon accuracy. You're allowed to have your own opinion. But, there's a character, the love interest, named Alice Faulkner, who was a rewritten version of Irene Adler. She was also a prominent part of the play. And in fact, a page boy named Billy, who actually, fun fact, Billy in the stories wasn't named Billy until after the play. And so it's believed that Arthur Conan Doyle actually named the page boy Billy after Sherlock Holmes by William Gillette. But that's, you know, fun fact. So, a lot of stuff like that, different people that appear in the play, they actually help a lot more than Watson does until at least sort of the 3rd act of the play, which is even more prominent in the film version, which was filmed in 1916 and was actually recently rediscovered. It was thought to be lost and now it's not. I actually haven't seen it, because I think that it's still only been shown in sort of one-off showings in different places across the country. If I'm incorrect about that, please let me know. I would love to sort of get my hands on it and see the horror show for myself. But, I think that it's hard to sort of watch and get a hold of, so I haven't actually seen it yet. But I know from reading stuff online that, again, Watson is not a very prominent part of it. 2 of the sort of smaller misconceptions that started with this adaptation were silly things that I think are just sort of fun to talk about. One of them is the curved pipe, which actually I've read William Gillette ask for the curved pipe so that it wouldn't block his face from the stage. In any case, the curved pipe became, of course, part of the essential Holmes silhouette, and we still know about it to this day, but Holmes never actually smokes a curved pipe in any of the stories, and in fact his favorite pipe is a black clay pipe. It's a very long, sort of long-stemmed pipe. It's been seen in a lot of adaptations that have gone back to the source material in Granada, in a recent BBC special. The favorite pipe does make appearances, but everybody sort of knows Holmes as having that curved pipe, and that was William Gillette. Another thing that is sourced in the William Gillette play is "Elementary, my dear Watson." Obviously you've heard the phrase a lot, but it's never uttered in a single one of Conan Doyle's stories. At least not within those words. Holmes says elementary, or he says things like "exactly, my dear Watson," but the two were never put together until William Gillette's play. And everybody thinks that Holmes said it. That's William Gillette's fault. Yet again. Thanks, William Gillette. Not really. I may be a little bitter about William Gillette. Sorry if you're a fan. So, these are all little things that sort of started with the William Gillette play. One of those bigger trends that started with that play that I want to carry on talking about is Watson's characterization. So like I said, Watson doesn't get to do much in William Gillette's Sherlock Holmes. He helps a little, but not as much as other characters do, at least not until the final third of the play. This is a problem because it didn't end there, and a lot of people still think of Watson that way. In fact, one of the later adaptations probably made it worse. You may know what adaptation I'm about to start talking about. I'm talking about, of course, the Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce films, which started being filmed in 1939. It was a series of 14 films. They are still, to this day, one of the most popular Holmes adaptations. They're a lot of people's favorite Holmes adaptations. Rathbone continues to be a favorite for Holmes. And I'm not necessarily attacking them specifically. The problem is the effect that they had. So, the films, like I said, started being made in 1939, which means they were being made during World War II. Eventually, there would be lots of World War II based sort of, I don't necessarily want to say propaganda, but they were actually set in their contemporary time period, the time in which they were made. So, modern adaptations are not the only adaptations to do that. The Rathbone and Bruce films did that. But that meant that as things went on, World War II became a part of the films, and they became used as sort of a tool to be uplifting to people in wartime, which meant also that they had to be very funny and lighthearted in a lot of ways. The production companies attempted very strongly to make them lighthearted and funny and fun and uplifting, and they decided, in part, that part of the way to do this was to make Watson into a comic relief character. A lot of people have argued that this isn't as apparent in 1939 Hound of the Baskervilles. I would argue that's not necessarily true. Having watched the 1939 Hound of the Baskervilles, there's a part where the criminal comes running out of the Baskerville Manor and runs into Watson, and Watson just falls down on the stairs. Which Holmes then also manages to go down into the criminal's hideout, and the criminal comes behind him and locks the door while he's in there. So at least they're both semi-incapable, but it's a little frustrating at times. Especially if you're familiar with the cases, and especially original Hound of the Baskervilles, which is my favorite. The problem with all of this, of course, isn't just that I like to be a crotchety old person about accuracy. The problem is also that Watson continues to be this sort of bumbling, incapable, not even particularly physically capable, definitely not very intelligent sort of sidekicky character all throughout the Rathbone and Bruce films. Even that wouldn't itself have necessarily been a problem, considering that in the cultural context it was viewed as a sort of necessary action, so much as that this continued to be the way that people characterized Watson for a very long time. And in fact, to this day, many non-Holmesians, if you sort of talk to them about Watson or ask them about Watson, picture Watson as essentially Nigel Bruce, sort of large and, bumbly and not really knowing much of what's going on and asking a lot of questions and just sort of following Holmes around and not really knowing what he's doing, etc. This is visible in other adaptations too, to slightly lesser extent, but mostly it stems from the Rathbone and Bruce films, which is a problem because Watson is very intelligent and very capable, and as much as I was a little worried about going into this, the problem is, of course, fat phobia in portrayals of Watson stemming from the Nigel Bruce characterization. I don't even think that Nigel Bruce is particularly rotund in any way. He's sort of built like a football player as far as I'm concerned. He's very tall and very broad. But people took the Nigel Bruce characterization and the fact that, I mean, there's a whole scene where he's playing with a stick of celery and a block of cheese, and he says, "This is Holmes and this is me," and they're eating at a restaurant. People associate him with food on top of with being large. And it's this kind of sort of marginally fatphobic characterization that would later be carried into Young Sherlock Holmes, made in 1985. I'm not gonna say much about Young Sherlock Holmes. I will say this much. Those actors were doing their best. But aside from that, Young Sherlock Holmes is a mess. Watson is characterized as pretty much eating constantly, and in fact, there's an entire sequence in which he, Holmes, and Holmes's girlfriend are drugged with a foreign substance. The drug causes them to hallucinate, and Watson's hallucinations involve food, specifically pastries, attacking him and forcing themselves into his mouth. It is not a great watch. I really wouldn't recommend it, but it's always there if you need to get drunk and have a fun time. But it's definitely absolutely very, very fatphobic, and it's very sad and very upsetting, and that is one of the unfortunate sort of side effects that comes with the Nigel Bruce characterization. I don't necessarily think, from what I know of, that the original Holmes and Watson films with Rathbone and Bruce were fatphobic, but the result of the way that people characterize Nigel Bruce Watson is kind of fatphobic, and still a lot of parody cartoons that draw on the Nigel Bruce characterization draw Watson as sort of round. It's a very weird, iffy territory, and I'm not fond of it, but that's definitely a side effect. However, the larger problem, of course, is that Watson is characterized as just completely at a loss all of the time, and Young Sherlock Holmes definitely suffered from that too. Watson just sort of following Holmes around and being like, "Gee whiz, Holmes, by Jove, what is that? What's going on? I don't understand." Which is a little bit in play in the canon, but the difference in canon is that Watson is telling the story. So you see all of the wheels moving in his head before you see him say anything. So a lot of the time, Watson will look at the hat that Holmes has told him to deduce, notice all of these little fine details, and then say, "I don't see anything important," because he doesn't think that what he sees is important. He sees it, he just doesn't know how to draw connections the way that Holmes does. He's intelligent, but he's not Holmes. He's just a different kind of intelligent, and a lot of that gets lost when you make Watson just the sort of questiony, followy sidekick. Of course, obviously, this has gotten better and better and better with time, and in fact, even one of the adaptations almost right after Rathbone and Bruce's films, the 1950s television version of Sherlock Holmes, produced by Sheldon Reynolds, starring Ronald Howard as Holmes, often known as Howard Holmes affectionately, stars a Watson who is physically capable, if not necessarily, like, super intelligent. He teaches Holmes how to punch people, he pulls rugs out underneath criminals. He's very, very useful in his sort of rough and tumble way, and it's hard not to like him. It's pretty great. So, as time went on, this improved within the Holmesian community, although arguably Pastiche still has a little bit of a problem with that, but that's not what this video is about. And so it just continues to be a lingering issue, and most of it does stem from that Nigel Bruce characterization. A side effect of the Nigel Bruce characterization often involves a harmful portrayal of Holmes. I don't mean harmful necessarily to other people, but definitely to Holmes's character himself. Holmes is not the solitary, cold-hearted jerk that a lot of people seem to think he is. A lot of people are coming to realize this now, but for a very, very, very long time, people thought Sherlock Holmes was just kind of an awful dude. If you watch a lot of different adaptations, one of the main words you could use to characterize him is, you know, kind of a jerk. Even if there's something else going on underneath, he's very, very rude. And that's just not true in the original canon. There are lots of times that Holmes goes out of his way to make sure his clients are comfortable, not just women, men too. He does all sorts of little polite things, little interactions. He ribs Scotland Yard for being sort of incapable sometimes. He plays practical jokes on people. He can be a little callous, but he's never openly rude. The way that, especially to vulnerable people, the way that he often is in other adaptations. Notably, things like House, but House is a Holmes adaptation, if you were unaware, but I think most people are aware by now. So, I think this is a side effect of devaluing Watson. When you lose the equal partnership between Holmes and Watson, you make Holmes into a sort of lone, wolfy, solitary character, or at least a character who doesn't have the sort of balance of being with his friend all the time. I don't want to say that Watson humanizes Holmes, because I think there's a lot of harmful implications in saying things like that. But the problem is that when you lose Watson and what Watson adds to the stories, you get stories about just Holmes being a detective. And those are very different stories from the stories with Holmes and Watson. Holmes and Watson are together at the core of the original stories, and to devalue one of them usually means putting a lot more value on the other, in this case Holmes, is often the case, and people start to make Holmes into something he's not, because you lose the balance. So, he becomes this super logical, super computer sort of person, which is not really who he is. It's who Watson sometimes says he is, but regardless of your interpretation of that, if you really read into Holmes's behavior, that's not necessarily true. These problems with Watson and Holmes's characterization, though, aren't the only problems at play in adaptation trends. One of the biggest problems is that of Irene Adler and or Holmes's female love interests. So, in the original canon, Holmes never had a female love interest. You may argue that he had feelings for Irene. I would disagree, but that's my personal opinion. But aside from that, and even including that, he was never in a relationship with a woman in any canon story, except for his fake relationship with Agatha the Maid in Charles Augustus Milverton, but that's if you want to count that, I guess. Aside from that, he was never in a relationship with a woman. Of course, films just go wild with this. Holmes has a female love interest in most adaptations. Most of them. He certainly has one in William Gillette's Sherlock Holmes. In every version of that, it's never taken away, it's never gotten rid of. Alice Faulkner is always there. And she was, as I said earlier, a rewritten version of Irene Adler. So, this Irene Adler-y character being Holmes's love interest has a long history. The problem isn't just what this does to Holmes's characterization in making him have a female love interest. The problem is also what this does to Irene Adler. There are 3 recent adaptations which have perpetuated a very particular kind of narrative. In the 2009 Sherlock Holmes, made by Guy Ritchie, Irene Adler is a villain who works for Moriarty, who is ultimately defeated due to her feelings for Holmes. In the 2012 BBC Sherlock episode, Irene is a villain who works for Moriarty, who, depending upon your interpretation of the episode, is ultimately defeated. Well, she's ultimately defeated either way. She has to be saved by Holmes at the end of the episode, by Sherlock, I guess I should say, and depending on your interpretation, she may or may not have feelings for him. In the 2013 episodes featuring Irene Adler of Elementary, Irene Adler is Moriarty and is ultimately defeated by Watson, which is a nice shift, I guess, but is still a problem. The problem, of course, is found when you go back to the original canon. Irene Adler was the victim of a scandal in Bohemia. She was not the client, but the King of Bohemia, who was the client, had already been victimizing her, having people break into her apartment, attempt to steal the photos that she had taken with him when she was in a relationship with him, and absolutely victimized her in several different ways, horribly mistreated her, and Holmes and Watson are aware of this at the end of the case. They take the case, I believe partially for the money. Watson raises objections to this at the beginning of the case, Holmes by the end. Nobody likes the King of Bohemia. The King of Bohemia is the antagonist of A Scandal in Bohemia. It is not Irene Adler. Irene Adler, on the other hand, has very little interest in Holmes at all, except perhaps as a semi-worthy nemesis. I shouldn't even say nemesis. Well, nemesis, because if anybody is in the wrong, Holmes is kind of in the wrong. But aside from that, Irene sees him as a worthy person, as a worthy sort of adversary and intellectually, but she's not interested in him romantically. She gets married to Godfrey Norton in the case itself. She clearly loves him very much. She just wants to leave with her husband and be free of the King of Bohemia, which she does ultimately by completely just decimating Sherlock Holmes. She defeats him entirely. She tricks him, gets away, and leaves a letter pretty much just to say, hey, it was kind of fun to sort of, spar with you, but I won, and it was kind of easy. But you did your best. See you later. She's definitely not in love with him in any capacity, not even a little, and she definitely never, ever, ever worked for Moriarty, and she wasn't a villain at all. What Irene Adler was, though, is a woman who was both a mistress of a king, married to a man, under sort of iffy circumstances for the Victorian period. They had to be married by a certain time, which is kind of strange. She's called an adventuress in the story itself, which was slang in a lot of ways for a lot of different sort of morally dubious things. In spite of the fact that she's not respectable in Victorian terms, she's very, very sympathetic in the case in which she appears. This is in the 1800s. In the 2000s, apparently, we've decided that this translates to villain who works for the primary antagonist of the entire series or series of films. That troubles me in a lot of different ways, and even if the trend has its twists in BBC and Elementary, I still think that by having Irene play this villain and work for Moriarty or be Moriarty and ultimately lose is bad. It's just bad. And it says a lot of bad things about portrayals of women in Holmes adaptations, even if there are better portrayals of women to be contrasted with. It's not great, and it is, in my opinion, one of the worst trends that adaptations have sort of perpetuated. There's also very notably a character that some of these portrayals of Irene are likely based on in The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, a 1970 film. Gabrielle, or Elise, as her real name is heavily based on Irene Adler. She is actually an antagonist and actually a German spy, and she only barely loses to Holmes because Mycroft figures her out. Holmes doesn't actually figure out what she's up to. There is no problem with Gabrielle or Elise as a character, in fact, particularly because she wasn't even named Irene Adler, and I guess she probably was based on Irene, but it's more that modern versions of Irene have been based on her, I think, is the problem at hand. So Irene, as this seductive antagonist character, stems, I think, largely from Gabrielle/Elise's portrayal in The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, and it's led to this troubling issue of Irene becoming a femme fatale when originally she was a really, really interesting and compelling character, very much with her own story, very much separate from Holmes, definitely separate from Moriarty. So that's that trend. Another interesting trend, and this gets to Moriarty, is Moriarty as a villain. Moriarty was written only to kill off Holmes. Arthur Conan Doyle needed to find a way to get rid of Holmes because he finally did want to get rid of him, and he invented Moriarty on sort of a spur-of-the-moment thought. He needed a nemesis who appeared out of nowhere who could actually kill Holmes. So Moriarty, up until the final problem, only appears in the final problem. He also later appears sort of in a retconny way in the Valley of Fear, But in the final problem, Watson has never heard of Moriarty, which is why I say retcon, because in the Valley of Fear, Moriarty's there, and it took place before Reichenbach, but Watson didn't know who he was in the final problem. It's a whole thing. Anyway, what's interesting then is that Moriarty really, comparatively, is not a very prominent villain in the series. However, due to adaptations, he's widely known as Holmes's greatest nemesis. Of course, some of this stems from the fact that he almost killed Holmes, and he led to the Reichenbach confrontation, which is a great dramatic scene, a great climax to your film, but Moriarty is not the only or the greatest antagonist in the original canon. There's Charles Augustus Milverton, there's John Clay from the Red-Headed League, there's all sorts of different great villains, and they all get overshadowed by Moriarty because people picked up Moriarty as the villain to play with. He's in William Gillette's Sherlock Holmes, he's in the Rathbone and Bruce films, he's in the Ritchie films, he's in BBC, she's in Elementary. Moriarty is everywhere. Moriarty is at the center of every conspiracy in almost every single adaptation. Which makes for a good way to tie things together, but it kind of is sort of interesting if you go back to the canon just because Moriarty so rarely appears. So what I want to do next, and finally, is take a look at a specific case that has been adapted almost more than any other, and examine a couple of misconceptions, not even misconceptions, things that have been carried from adaptation to adaptation that weren't in the original story, and take that as a way of looking at the ways that adaptations build on each other, again. So what I want to do is look at The Hound of the Baskervilles. The Hound of the Baskervilles has probably, I don't have the numbers and data to back this up, but probably I would say been adapted more than any other case in canon. It's one of the most popular Holmes stories. It's definitely the one that's the most well-known. If you're talking to somebody that's not a Sherlockian, usually if they've read one of the stories, it's probably Hound. This isn't a problem. Hound is one of my favorite cases, like, ever, but that's because I love Watson so much. So one thing that's interesting is Watson's sort of varied participation. To talk about that, I want to start by talking about how the story was originally written. The Hound of the Baskervilles was written after Holmes had already been killed off. It was written in between the final problem and the empty house. What this means is that when Doyle was actually starting to write The Hound of the Baskervilles, it wasn't a Sherlock Holmes story. He wanted to write a gothic novel, he started getting all the plot down, but he didn't really know what to do with it. He was offered an awful lot of money to write another Holmes case. Everybody said this would be a good Holmes story. The two things went together, and he decided to make The Hound of the Baskervilles, which he'd already started writing, into a Holmes case. What he did then is stuck Watson into the role of the protagonist, sort of inserted Holmes midway through the case, added a little at the beginning, that whole thing at the end, and it became a Holmes story. I still think it's an immensely successful story, a case, everything, I love it, but it's partly because of that, I think, that Watson gets a lot of his own screen time. So, arguably, that's something that you could change, and a lot of people have. It's not accurate, it's kind of a bummer to me, but people have changed it in the BBC version, in the Elementary version, and other versions too. Holmes goes with Watson on the case, and Watson doesn't get to solve their own cases. So, I say they because I'm referring partially right now both to the Elementary and the BBC version, so gender is a factor there. So, in the original Hound of the Baskervilles, Watson solves, either accidentally or on purpose, two different cases pretty much on his own. He has a little bit of help from Sir Henry Baskerville, but he both finds a serial killer who was hiding out on the moor and figures out that people were sneaking him food, and he also finds the man who has been following him throughout the story. He does both of these things without much help, and there are some circumstances that help him out with that, but it's still really cool and interesting to see Watson solve his own cases. This gets taken away whenever you have Holmes participate in most of the case, because there's no time for Watson to be running off on their own, doing their own thing. Watson in the elementary version does get to do a little of her own tracking down, because Holmes is a little bit busy, but it doesn't have the same effect as the original stories. Even some older versions have Holmes going with Watson or appearing earlier, or even just have Watson doing less before Holmes gets there. This isn't the only thing, though, and this is one of those peculiar little things that I think is interesting, has been pulled from adaptation to adaptation. In the 1939 Hound of the Baskervilles with Rathbone and Bruce, Dr. Mortimer, who in the stories is a young doctor who was just graduated from Charing Cross Hospital, was given a cane from the people when he left, and went out to become a country practitioner. He's young, he's absent-minded. That's one of the descriptions they have of him. He's young, though, is one of the key factors there. And they actually have a conversation where Watson and Holmes only have his walking stick, and they debate his age. Watson insists that he's old, Holmes insists that he's young, and Holmes, of course, is right. In adaptations, starting with the 1939 Hound of the Baskervilles, Dr. Mortimer is an older man. And it also appears in a 2002 television film starring Richard Roxburgh and Ian Hart. So, all of these versions likely took their inspiration from the 1939 adaptation and not the original canon, which is not necessarily a problem, except again, it's one of those things that you start to notice, and more people pick up on it. All kinds of different adaptations of Hound have had an older Dr. Mortimer, and I think that it in part is because of the 1939 film version, because adaptations borrow from each other and not just the canon. Another example of this, particularly with two adaptations, but I think it might appear in some others as well, is the seance. In the 1939 Hound of the Baskervilles, again, Dr. Mortimer's wife, Mrs. Mortimer, holds a seance. She is, I suppose, a medium, partially probably in sort of response to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's interest in spiritualism. Mrs. Mortimer holds a seance, and they have a seance in Baskerville Hall that Henry and Watson attend together, and it's a whole scene in the 1939 film. This scene reoccurs in the 2002 adaptation with Ian Hart and Richard Roxburgh. So, this one little scene got carried from a 1939 film to a 2002 film, even though it has no basis in the canon. This is interesting to me because this sort of intertextual self-referentiality is what builds adaptations now. All of the adaptations that we are now familiar with are referencing this giant legacy of film adaptation. The Guinness Book of World Records cites Holmes as the most portrayed film character of all time. And in fact, I've also read that he is second most portrayed character of all time, second only to Hamlet, which is obviously above Holmes due to stage adaptations. So, Holmes has this massive, massive legacy of individual characterizations, and differences, and different portrayals of each character, and villains, and all of these are the history that make up modern adaptations. So these trends have happened because adaptations build off of each other, as well as the canon, as well as off of pastiche, and everything becomes sort of interwoven together in ways that can be really interesting and open new possibilities for ways to undermine existing trends, or to say, hey, nobody's done this before, or they did it like this, but I could do it this way. And some of that's being done, but when we don't do that, we risk also these issues with misconceptions that have been carried through over and over, particularly with less than ideal portrayals of Irene Adler, of Watson, that deal with these characters in sort of a harmful and unkind way, and all of that also comes from this giant legacy. So, it's interesting and exciting, but it also causes problems, and I just think it's something interesting, but also something that we should be critical of. So that's all I've got for this video. So, I know it's a lot. Process it all. Take it all in. It's okay. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you want me to talk about particular adaptations, a trend that you think that I missed, something else interesting, please do let me know. I would love to make more videos like this. If you did like the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel if you want to see more stuff like this. I'm also going to start making videos about each individual case and canon, little sort of summaries and fan facts for people that don't want to read the canon or don't have time or even just want a refresher. So that'll be starting soon. I have lots of other Holmes content, maybe pastiche reviews, adaptation reviews coming up. So if you're interested in all of that, subscribe, like the video. Feel free to get in touch with me if there's something that you'd like to see. I would love to do it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.